Using your talents. You feel like you have a lot of talents? Just bubbling with all kinds of things to be used in general, let alone for the Lord. I was a guy at the talent shows that watched. I certainly wasn't going to sing. I couldn't play any instruments. I have a video for the right money I can share with some of you. I videoed Christian, some of his buddies last night, practicing before the prom a couple of their dances. And Christian stood and watched most of it. And he said, I'll do this one. And he was wrong. He did not do it. So, and he got that ability from me. So what talents do we have? I can't even juggle for that matter. And so what can I do? We're going to look tonight at the fact that you are talented, that you are precious, that God has intended to use you. And it's important that you do use your talents for God. We're talking about the kind of faith that's more than just thoughts. The kind of faith that really changes lives. Right? The kind of life that changes community, that changes the world. I look at what took place in the New Testament, and sometimes I don't recognize that faith. I'm not sure if all the time, because it's a daunting task, I'm not sure that we all the time really believe that kind of faith exists. But it does. And it's the same faith we're called to today. It's the same faith that is able and possible to change not just my life, but my life. And if it can change my life, it can turn the world upside down. We're going to look in a few moments at Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. But I want to plant a seed before we get there into the context. And that is that when we think about the man using his talents for God, for the master in Matthew 25, I think we are prone to looking at other people and saying, man, look at what they're able to do. Look at what so-and-so's able to do. And I can't do those things. I mean, I gave you a whole list of things I can't do, and I know in your mind you added 15 to them that I can't do. But if you got around thinking about yourself, that's probably something that you thought about. But I'm thinking of a few verses. Number one, Jeremiah, the 18th chapter Corey read for us. There God says, Jeremiah, I want you to go down to the potter's house, and then I'll tell you what my word is for you. And can you imagine, Lord, just tell me now. You ever wonder how far it was to the potter's house? Was it just across town? Was it quite a travel? Did it take a whole day? Or how far is it? But go there and I'll tell you. And when he gets there, he understands why he's there. Because the illustration is that Israel is clay in the hands of the master. And the illustration is that God is making and forming us for his purpose. Now, if Corey would have continued to read 5 through at least 11, we would have saw that Jeremiah is speaking to the nation of Israel, and he's saying, you've not been what you're called to do. And then verse 12 gets to this point that I think it's real relevant to us. Verse 12 says, but you've said that I'm going to be my own thing. And you've been stubborn and not submitted to what God has asked you to be. There's two sides there. Number one, you are formed by God. That's how the book of Jeremiah gets started. Jeremiah was called to be a prophet before he was ever Jeremiah. Before he was ever formed, before he was ever born. He had a purpose. Same's true of you. You were made by God. None of you are like me. And I had all kind of amens rolling last week because I threatened to preach until I got... By the way, I forgot to tell Casey, she's in AB, I only got 2 from you last week, Casey, not the 3 that we agreed upon. But you were made by God. I was made by... You're not like me. And you're not like anyone else. And that's important. It's what makes you useful. It's what makes you necessary. I told Anna, go outside and get me one of those river rocks from landscaping. You know how this rock got round? Did it start out that way? This is actually rather porous for a river stone. I'm surprised this one. Kevin, he's telling us out. The pressures of life, I mean the stream, push this rock over and over and over and over and over again. Each time just wearing down and snapping off. It's unique and personal characteristics. Romans 12 says, be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed, verse 2, by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove that which is acceptable and good will of God. Be not conformed to this world. Do you ever wonder what that's like? That's what this is. It's being conformed. Now, when we read that verse, we think of all the things of this world. They're negative, they're sinful. But not all the pressures of this world are sinful. But there's a lot of pressure to conform. The fact that we live in the Western Hemisphere has an impact, tremendous impact on us. The fact that we live in this country has a tremendous impact on us. The fact that you live in this state has a tremendous impact on you. The fact that you live in or around Summerville has impacted you uniquely. How's that happen? By becoming just a little bit more like the person you're next to. You know, Jerry, why my beard's not any longer than it is? That was really wise. Amanda got me to trim it a few months ago. What's that? That was your second choice. And it's only this long because I've been fighting this internal battle not to do what's right. I mean, what Amanda wants, right? But think about it, it's something silly. Does it matter how long my beard is? Well, Amanda will tell you yes. And apparently I think so because I'm expressing an opinion on the matter, right? But we face pressures, don't we? All kinds of pressures. Anytime we're part of a culture, it's part of our edges being rubbed off. Now, that's a positive thing in some ways with the church. When we involve ourselves in a community of believers, it should impact me. It should help me to be all that I'm meant to be. But yet there's this next layer of pressure of conformity. That's to be like everyone else and to pressure everyone to be like me. And that we must be careful with. That we must reject. Because many of your characteristics were formed and designed by God to be used by God. Now, in around verse 3 there, Corey read that things just didn't go well for the potter. So he clumps it all up. Boy, have I been through that process numerous times in my life, right? Where it seems like your whole life just gets lumped and thrown back, and then you get to be remade. In an earthly setting, sometimes the potter makes a mistake. In our context, God doesn't make mistakes. You know why I need to be remade? I have lumps. I'm not real good clay. And so I've got to be, I've got to be refashioned. I've got to be worked on. In other words, I think at its heart, this is the idea I'm trying to get at. I can be improving me while still being me. Because improving me is getting to the version of me, not even the version of me, the me that God has intended. But it is your unique abilities, it is your talents that God is going to use to further the church. This morning I spoke a little bit about the merger. You know, one of the beautiful things about the merger is the folks at Roseville aren't like you. In some ways they are. In other ways they're not. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Let's make sure we use our talents to serve God. Before we get into Matthew 25, I want to consider the context of this chapter, because this is one of those great parables that Jesus told, and it was so great and it's so well known that so oftentimes we just kind of isolate it and we think of it all by itself. And it's powerful enough in that context. But when we understand what it means and what Jesus was saying in context, it has even a greater meaning for us. Because it's important for us to remember that when Jesus tells this parable, Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, that Jesus is in the last sprint, the last leg running to the cross. He's in his last days. And just before this, in chapter 23, I've called it the woeful chapter. He says, "Woe unto you." Think about this. All these people, the Pharisees is primarily who he's talking about in that chapter. They had all the answers. And you know what they were doing? Is they were making sure everyone was exactly like them. And if they weren't like them, they cast them out. Now here's what's interesting. In Luke, the 11th chapter, Bill Fiskus taught the Bible study at Roseville this morning. And in Luke, the 11th chapter, Jesus is on the Pharisees, and the lawyers speak up and say, "Hey, you're insulting us too." and Jesus says, "Well, about you." And he unloads on them for the same reason, right? They had all the answers. They had more answers than God. And Jesus is pushing back about all these rules that they had made that God had not made. One of the questions that was asked is, why did they make them? Well, it's obvious. They should have been there. You see, the Pharisees and lawyers were smart enough to know that God should have put them in the law. And so they just helped them out a little bit with it. And so Jesus is addressing that very group of people, that very mindset. And he's saying, woe unto you. Don't be like that. And in the very next chapter is they leave Jerusalem because they are in Jerusalem when they're saying that. And as they leave, it's almost like the disciples have said, but boy, it sure is a beautiful place, isn't it? Do you see those stones? And Jesus in the destructive chapter says, man, I really hate to tell you this, but they're all coming down in about 40 years. Right? That's not his words. Don't go to Matthew 24 and say, now where's that quote? But that's what Jesus says. They're all coming down. And then as he comes into chapter 25, the chapter we're looking at tonight, in light of that destruction, he says you need to be prepared. And he tells the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 of which were prepared and had their lamps trimmed and their oil filled, and 5 of which were surprised and weren't prepared. And I don't know about you, but in that context, doesn't it make sense to ask, how should I be prepared? Right? But how should I be ready? Try and decide who to pick on for this illustration. Mike, you're kind of out here by yourself. But you're not much of a hunter, are you? I'm certainly not an avid, yeah. What is your hobby? Pleasing Brenda. We're just going to pretend Mike's a hunter, but he's just a fine man. I'm having trouble finding a foothold here. Think about this for a second. If Brenda says, Mike, when I get home, I want you to be ready. Do you think it's an important question for Mike to ask, for what? Because if she wants him to be ready to go out to eat, and he's ready to go hunting, he's got his camo on, he's got his gun ready, right? We've got a problem, don't we? Mike has a problem. And so Jesus says, listen, this destruction's coming, be prepared. And we're going to touch on using our talents because that's what comes next. But it's also good to look at what's on the backside of this. As Jesus says, he gets done, he says, use your talents, don't waste them. And then he says, I'm paying attention how you treat one another. Destruction's come. Are you treating one another well? Have you addressed the needs of those around you that are wanting? Have you shown the kind of love that I would have you to show? Talk about isolating, passages at Matthew 25. In fact, that's kind of a phrase now, Matthew 25 Christian. And it's used as a positive and a negative. I'm a Matthew 25 Christian, meaning I'm about serving my fellow mankind, and I'm about showing Jesus' love to people. And then it's used by others as a negative connotation, like, there's more than just serving one another. Well, that passage is not isolated. It's here in this group, and it all fits together. How do we use our talents, and why is that so important? Now, we're going to look at this passage 14 through 30, but before I do so, I want to pause and just kind of remind us what happens in this chapter. So we're going to break it up and look at individual parts. So Jesus tells them, after he gets done telling them the parable about being prepared, he says, it's kind of like this guy that went away. And before he went away, he gave his property, his belongings, his money, his interest, his investments to these 3 servants, these 3 employees. One of them he gave 5 talents, which is a weight we'll get to in a moment. Another he gave 2, and yet another he gave 1, each according to his ability. And he went away. And immediately, the one who has 5 invests and works those 5. And the one with 2 immediately invests and works those 2. And then the third was way smarter than the other 2. And he says, I know what kind of guy I'm working for. And man, he's harsh. I'm not about to lose his investments. And so he takes and he digs a hole in the ground and he buries that investment. The man comes back to the servant, and the one that has 5 has doubled his investment. He says, man, you've done a good job. I'm going to put you in charge of more. See, that's the value, that's the reward of doing a job well. You get more jobs. And so the master said, I'm going to give you more. You've been faithful over a little. I will put you over much. The man who was given 2 talents has no less of a commendation from the master. He provides 4. Not 10, only 4. And yet the response is the same by the master. He says, you've done wonderful. You've been faithful over little. I will put you in charge or over much. And then he turns to the third individual who was able to provide what God gave him intact and whole. And can't you see the pride in his face? I didn't lose not 1 penny. Why didn't you do anything with it? Because I know the type of guy you are. Demanding and all. I wanted to make sure I had it all for you when you came back. And his story doesn't end near as beautiful. With that in mind, would you look at verses 14 and 15 with me of Matthew 25? For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. We have understanding the assignment. Did they understand the assignment? We're given very little detail in those 2 verses about what the master does and does not say. But this I know, he has 3 servants. He splits his whole property among. These 3 surely knew the master and knew him well. It was important that they understood not only the letter of the command, but the spirit of the command. What's the spirit of the command? It was to be like the master. He was giving it to them so that they would use it in the fashion that he had used it. It wasn't to just keep it safe. Did he want it to be safe? Yes. Did he want it to be preserved? Yes. But it was to be used like the master wanted it to be used. See, sometimes we glaze over this point, and as a kid, I don't know why, but I still have funny thoughts, but I always thought about this story in terms of the master just randomly giving 3 people. They used to say, here, take care of this. That's not what's happening. He's giving it to employees, to servants, They had an obligation. They owed him their allegiance and their actions. You see, this wasn't their bank account. Jesus isn't telling a story about an individual who took his bank account, the money out of the bank. Interesting illustration right now, isn't it? And then buried it in the ground so it would be safe. That's the point. It was the master's money. You know, sometimes when we talk about our Christian duty, I think it's easy to overlook because it's not an easily defined concept. Therefore, it's not always comfortable. It's easy to overlook that I'm supposed to not only keep the letter of the law, but I'm to maintain the spirit of the law. I referenced earlier Luke, the 11th chapter. And there Jesus tells them they're on him about not washing his hands before he eats. Probably a good thing to do, wash your hands before you eat. But they had made it a spiritual law. And he goes on to tell them, in essence, if I understand them correctly, you have taken my law and have used it to abuse people. You heap heavy burdens on them, and you don't so much as lift a finger to help them. You've taken what's meant to be beneficial to mankind and made it a burden. He goes on to tell them, you tithe, take 1/10. They were to give 1/10 of everything. And so you go to your cupboard and you make sure even the smallest of spices you split out and give 1/10, and you feel pretty righteous for that. Is it easy to overlook the pennies? Yeah, don't worry about those pennies, right? I mean, get change from a cashier and they short you a penny. I won't ask you whether you say anything or not, but at this point I think we can all agree on it's not near the big deal as if they short you a 20. They're saying, I took care of the pennies. And he says, you forgot what? Justice and mercy, what he called the weightier issues of law. They forgot the spirit. They forgot that at its core, what they were meant to be doing was acting like the Father who had given them all these things. Two of them understood the assignment. One did his own thing. Secondly, I think it's easy for us, and I think this is why Jesus is telling, the parable just before this with the 10 virgins, we could get the impression that they're supposed to wait till he returns. And I think that may be one of the motivating ideas that Jesus is telling this parable. At no point in this parable is the concept to wait. Sometimes do we get that idea as Christians? I think so. We got to not do these things and not do those things and not do this and just hang on until our Lord gets back. And the point that Jesus is making is, no, you need to take what I've given you and put it to use. See, you're not supposed to be waiting. You're supposed to be using. And not the way that it happens all the time. Not using other people, but using what I've given you for the benefit of other people. It's not about waiting. And thirdly, as I kind of introduced this idea earlier, it's about nonconformity. They were different from one another. One was given 5. One was given 2. And another was given 1, according to their ability. You think that's useful? Absolutely. Absolutely. You see, if the man who, we know he failed anyhow, so let's talk about the man who had 2. If the man who had 2 had tried to act like the man with 5, it doesn't work. If the man with 5 tried to act like the one with 2, it doesn't work. But here's what's important. And I started out alluding to the fact that I'm a one-talent man. And how many times do we hear, I'm just a one-talent Christian. I don't have a lot to offer. I don't have a lot to do. A talent in gold was worth how much? You have any idea? $2.25 million. Now, of course, if it was silver, and we're not told the kind of money they gives them, if it was silver, it was considerably more, yet a lot of money. I'm going to go with gold just because I like that concept a little bit better. Jerry, if I give you $2.25 million of my dollars to take care of for me, do I trust you? And if I give it to you, I've already stated I do trust in you. I don't give someone $2.25 million if I don't trust him. Part of that trust is I think he's capable. Right? I'm not just trusting his integrity and truthfulness. I'm trusting his capability. Right? There's a lot of truthful people that I wouldn't trust with my credit card. What's my point? The principle, the idea here is not that the one-talent man had no skill. Jesus, the master, had faith in him. The point's not about how much talent you have. It's about what you do with it. You're trusted. You were formed. You were created with purpose. And it's important that we remember that. Verses 16 through 18, what do they do with this? He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So he also, who had had the 2 talents, made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Mr. Opportunity, or Mr. Opportunity. I point to Mom because she's asked me several times to preach on this over the years and give me this illustration. Here we have it. We're either Mr. Opportunity or Mrs. Opportunity, but it doesn't have near the ring, does it, Brenda? Or missed your opportunity. 2 of them seized it. 2 of them put it to work. I mentioned this here a few weeks ago, but we are wired to overemphasize losses. Not just with money, with everything in our lives. We pay attention to it. And there's an element when we are living our lives that pays off. I mean, that's why we keep our kids off the road rather than saying, well, I could make another, right? There's an element that serves us well, but it doesn't serve us well when it comes to serving God or to accomplishing anything for that matter. We've got to get over our fear. We've got to get over our fear of doing wrong. We've got to get over our fear of making mistakes. We've got to get over our fear of failing. Anything worth doing well is worth doing wrong or poorly. Ali, we talked about this today. Ali's giving a speech at convention, and she is doing a stunning job of it. How you feel about giving your speech, Ali? You see that? It's her first. She's got a great speech, and she's going to do a wonderful job. But it's not going to be at Dale Carnegie's level. You know who Dale Carnegie is? You'll have to Google him later. It's her first speech. Right? We're not going to do everything well. It's a church. We're not going to do everything well. We're going to mess it up. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to be wrong. We're going to be less than we could. and ought to. And the same is true of us as individuals. But only one of these three is truly concerned with that. Here's what's interesting to me. We only have the final result. Two of them end up winning the day. You think they didn't have any downturns? You don't think they made any bad investments? The guy with 2 talents had $5 million to invest. Remember that old Richard Pryor movie? You won't remember it, Allie. Where he had 24 hours to spend $1 million. Right? It was made back in the 80s when that would have been difficult to do. You have that much to invest, and you don't think you're going to make some bad decisions? You don't think you're going to have some downsides? You bet you are. We are too. That's not the point. Here's what's important. The view of our master is what makes all the difference. I believe when we see God as this intolerant tyrant just waiting for us to make a mistake so we can zap, when we think that our salvation, our purpose, and our cause is about doing everything right, and we're going to dig some holes and bury some talents. I believe when we understand the nature of God, when we understand our master, we're going to be using them. We're not afraid of being wrong. We're not afraid of making a mistake. That means we just do it our own way. That message isn't there either. Not even close, is it? No, it means we're charging forward, making sure that we don't ever waste what God has given us. You're valuable. You're precious. And you are needed. Oh yeah, as a side note, you have a purpose. Let's serve it individually and collectively. This evening, if you serve any other purpose than giving your life to Jesus Christ, and we can help you to better serve Jesus, please make that known as together we stand and sing.